everybody. Hopefully you can see me and hear me all right. Hopefully. Some of you just dialing in now. So my name's Ben from Rare Consulting. Hopefully this is what you're expecting on your screens. You should be able to see slides in front of you, and you should be able to see me as well. If you're new to GoToWebinar, there's a control panel there. So if you've got any issues, you can just raise your hand and the team can come and see if they can help you out. But in the meantime, I will get cracking. So yeah, thanks very much for making the session. So it should last about 45 minutes. It's quite a lot of us. It's quite a lot to cover in the session. So I'll do my best to try and, if you've got any questions and things like that, just pop them into the questions box. I'll be able to see them and I'll see if I can address them as we go through. But there is a Q&A at the end if you want to find out any more information. In terms of what we're going to cover in the session, so I'll talk to you a little bit about the project overall, so what we've been doing. Then I'll talk to you a little bit about sort of the context and there's some quite interesting new initiatives and ways that companies are responding to the pandemic, which I'll cover. Then I'll talk to you about the themes of the research we've found so far. So what are the kind of key things that we're seeing week on week? How does that evolve or change? And then we're going to do a section on brand perception. So not only are we measuring how consumers are responding, but we're also measuring what they think about different brands. So I'll talk to you about how different runners and riders are performing in that regard. And then we'll go into different categories. So we're measuring a bunch of different categories like grocery, alcohol, retail, beauty, a bunch of others, entertainment. And I'll give you this week's sort of latest in those sectors. Obviously, there's a lot to cover in one session. So if you've got any questions, then just let me know, or just fire me a question on here or via email. That's absolutely fine. So in terms of what we've been doing, we've for the past 6 weeks we've been tracking how consumer markets are responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're looking at how do people respond, what's their claimed level of behavior towards a particular category, and also how do they feel emotionally as we go through things. So we're being able to understand how they're feeling, what they're doing, tracking brand perception at the same time, and also we're supplementing this understanding with a diary study. So we've got our own qualitative research program where we ask different households to perform certain activities during a week. And then we asked them to diarise how they found those activities, what they were doing, how they felt, that sort of thing. And it's really fascinating kind of context to what we're seeing in the numbers, because obviously with more quantitative data, you can see the trends, but you don't necessarily know the story. So that's why we started that. So to begin with, I will just start off with some of the more recent sort of context that we're seeing at the moment. Obviously, the economic forecast is fairly sobering reading at the moment. But I suppose one thing that, unless you're sort of aware of it in too much detail, but the furlough scheme has been successful. So despite how government schemes generally will take quite a long time to actually be implemented, businesses did actually receive money from the government yesterday for the furlough scheme. So it has worked, which is a kind of amazing thing. I think slightly concerning for business owners at the moment is that the business interruption loans the approval rate with the banks is about half of what you see in Germany, which is a real big concern for any business of any size. Is access to that cash is really important at the moment, whether that's to continue operating in the way that you have been doing or to potentially explore new ways of driving revenue. And that's something we found in our B2B research, is that 26% of companies are exploring how they can generate new revenue during this period, which is absolutely mind-boggling when you think about it. I mean, just you take the number as on face level, it's quite an impressive number of people who are exploring it. And we also know there's a huge demand and appetite for the research data, hence why we've been doing these webinars each week. But I thought I'd start off with a poll before we start, just to get the cogs whirring, so you don't fall asleep in the back of the classroom. classroom, whatever. And the question for you is, how innovative has your company been to the COVID-19 pandemic? If we can open that up, it means I can take a swig. Very quick poll this, just to get a sense of how innovative you feel your company has been. And we can close that when we get enough responses. Interesting. Look at that. Yeah, curious. So yeah, I suppose that sort of falls in line with what we've seen some of the B2B research done so far. So quite a lot of you, so 18 plus 36, maths can't do that quick enough, claim that you know the business you work in has been extremely or very innovative during this period. I mean, that's really encouraging to see. You've obviously got 9% down there who you would claim the business they work in is not innovative at all. That's going to be interesting. I've been asked to run this session again this afternoon for a membership organisation. I'm going to ask the same question. We'll see what they say as well. But if we can close the poll and open back up to slides, that'd be great. So I think it's really interesting to see how companies are responding. Some people, you know, are being quite innovative and changing things up. Other companies actually are sort of, you know, hiding like a, you know, like a snail in a shell, and obviously protecting cash. I mean, that's the key thing at this particular point. But it's certainly not. It doesn't cost a lot to implement new initiatives. And I came across this this week, sorry, which I thought was really interesting. And this is there's a website called You Probably Need a Haircut, and it's something I can definitely relate to. Set up by a barber, and the whole idea is it's really easy. You give him $15, and he gives you a Zoom link, and he'll teach you how to cut your hair at home. Now, one thing that's been quite interesting in the data we've seen, I'll talk about this in more detail as we get there, but the number of people in the UK who want to do something productive with their time is quite interesting. And it might be that actually, if you're not able to get the barber, you could use a service like this. And you know, that's a really good example of a company that's come up with an innovation without spending a lot of money to do that. That's quite a simple way of solving a massive problem. And another one, I know the image isn't really appropriate for the statement. I just thought it was quite amusing to put some pictures of grandmas in my presentation. But there's a service that I came across this week called Dental Monitoring. It's a French company, and this is a really interesting innovation. And this is essentially, it's a little bit of hardware that you can buy online, attach it to your smartphone, and believe it or not, you pop it in your mouth, and it can monitor. It does a scan of your teeth in your mouth and your dental health. And it means that, you know, every year, obviously, we go to get our teeth checked. And obviously, whilst when lockdown measures, we don't know what's going to be happening there, and we don't know how long we're going to be restricted at homes. There's a really good example in the healthcare sector where actually you can still monitor how people's health is, obviously it's dental health, without the need of potentially risking viral infection. So I thought that's a really great example of innovation for the moment. And particularly, it's really good to see so many of you working in organizations where you're looking at doing more innovation at this particular time. But it is quite it's a real challenge to be innovative when you've got people sort of working remotely, and there's so much written about, you know, the problems of working remote. When we set our business up 5 years ago, we gave everyone a laptop and told them work wherever you want. And when the measures came in place, it was very easy for us to close down our office and for everyone to work remotely and spin up new initiatives and talk and collaborate. But I'm sure all of you are finding that, you know, it's quite hard sometimes over conference calls to connect with people, and that's been found in research. So there's been quite an interesting study done showing that just that small second delay between two people on a conference call can make someone feel like they're distant from somebody. So that's, you know, something to be aware of, I think, in the coming weeks of how we all communicate with each other. But talking of, you know, this is all, you know, useful and important context for why, you know, to which the data we've collected plays a role. And part of the research that we've done this week is to explore what's the difference between people who work in key work environments versus those that don't. So if you're a key worker or non-key worker, what's your sort of relationship with the working environment like? Because it's something that gets talked quite a bit, and it's interesting. I think there's lessons for those of us who work in categories that are not for non-key non-key workers. Sorry, I should say, is that there's huge lessons in how key workers have generated a sense of community together at this particular time, and how interestingly their level of job security is they feel a little bit more assured about how things are going. And we've been tracking the UK's population in terms of how it feels on a week by week basis, and it's quite interesting to compare those key workers with non-key workers and how they respond to things. And I thought what was really interesting about this when I first looked at it was, why are levels of happiness for key workers higher? Could it be that actually as a key worker you're more exposed to the reality of what's going on? And for lots of us who are non-key workers, maybe people who live in sort of city centres where you don't have a garden, don't have outdoor space, you can feel quite isolated from what's going on. Therefore, could add weight to this idea that actually non-key workers tend to feel more worried, and that's certainly what the data is showing us. So I think there's potentially some lessons in how teams in those circumstances work together. For lots of other companies, I think there's going to be some learnings there. So I'll be covering key workers in a bit more detail throughout this presentation. I think it's something that is quite a curious part of the working economy, because a lot of it kind of gets lumped together. And as much as there's been a lot of really good initiatives aimed at key workers over the past few weeks, there's also, if you look at the more qualitative data, there's evidence of which key workers are saying, well, hang on a minute, like we're fine. And this data in some respects does kind of back up this notion that maybe we're a little bit, I suppose, not so sophisticated in our understanding of what their working experience is, I think. But it's obviously a huge topic, and we will only really begin to sort of scratch the surface in the session today. So moving on then, I'm going to take you now through some more consumer data and what we found over the last few weeks in regard to our communities. And overall, if you look at the UK population at large, the overriding sentiment has been one of worry. So for the past 6 weeks, that's really been how that's been the lead emotion in the UK. It's interesting that the peak was certainly a couple of weeks ago, and it shows some signs of diminishing. And I think what's happening when you look at the numbers is that those people who were worried a couple of weeks ago now are feeling restless. So, and that makes sense. We've got a lot of people who've been put on furlough, 1 million people put on furlough over the period of a couple of weeks. So, you can see that, that would play into that particular narrative. It's interesting as well to look at how different cohorts respond to this. So baby boomers and the older generation are people who are more likely to feel worried, around 55%. And younger generations, so Generation Z is such a weird phrase, isn't it? They're the ones that actually have the highest level of reported happiness over this period. So your life stage, I think, does have a huge impact on how you're feeling at this particular point. And I think what is quite sort of a little bit alarming, to be perfectly honest, is the compliance with government regulations seems to be reducing. So if any of you were out at the weekend, you probably found in your area when the sun's out, everyone goes outside. And, unfortunately, there's not a lot you can sort of do to contain that in some cases. But that's, a particular message is that, yes, it is showing signs that people are less likely to abide by the guidelines. And funnily enough, generally tends to be men that don't listen. Yeah, that happens, and younger people as well are less likely to be following those guidelines. One kind of charming thing I think that's happened, I mean, if you can find, a charming thing over the past few weeks, is that our sense of community has changed considerably over the past sort of 6 weeks. And it's been interesting to measure how our sense of community to different aspects of our day-to-day life change. So as an example, what we have seen over the past 6 weeks is that people feel a higher sense of community to their family and their friends and their local area. So it's quite high. The majority, so you got 71% of people this week who feel a sense of community with their family. The thing that I found really quite interesting about this, just calling it out, is if you think about where we were as a country in December last year, Brexit, do you remember that? All the sort of difficulties we've struggled with as a nation, and there has been, not to get too political, but obviously it does create this kind of fractious dialogue that exists. I was quite heartened by this idea that over the past since the start of the pandemic, that we saw an increase in people's feeling of a sense of community with others around the world. But it's quite interesting over the last few weeks to see how that subsided slightly, and why that is. There's more work to be done to identify what that could be. There's a couple of theories that I do play a role, which I think, as other countries are at different stages with the pandemic and we're exposed to more media, we have more time to digest media and read more content. I think there might be an element where we compare ourselves to others and we might feel a little bit out of step with other people around the world. You've also got, unfortunately, 5G conspiracy theorists, which I think have done nothing but to exacerbate the geopolitical kind of dimension to that as well. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But when we've asked people about more reputational metrics, we have seen in our data that this idea of a brand being made in the UK and being local plays quite a big role. In fact, probably is more important as a driver to decision making than is from an internationally known brand. And that's going to be really important when you're thinking about comms, because there's very much a return at the moment to our local community. And it's interesting when we're exploring obviously how people are feeling, sense of community, and their kind of social lives in general. And again, just splitting that out for key workers as a subsect, again, just trying to add a bit more, I suppose, a bit more colour to this kind of narrative we have about them, is they are 1.4 times more likely to be socialising with their friends and family than the rest of the UK population. They're 1.5 times more likely to use chat services on their phone, so you find them more active on things like this, and they're more likely to be socialising out of the home. Of course, they're in work, in employment where they are more likely to be required to be out of the home in a lot of cases. So generally, you'll see that their social existence is a little bit different. Well, actually, it's quite considerably different when you think about it, to those who are non-key workers and the rest of the UK population. And it's interesting to see how you all responded to that poll earlier when I asked about how innovative do you feel that your company's being. And I mentioned just a moment ago about this issue of reputation. We're tracking that each week to see how the different categories are performing. So I'm going to open it up to another poll, now we're sort of halfway through, to see if we can just get that on everyone's screen. According to the UK, which sector is responding to the COVID-19 pandemic the best? Do you think it's retail, telcos, banking, or supermarkets? Just 4 sectors there for you. And we can close down the poll when we're ready. And share, you should be able to see. Whoa, interesting. 85% of people say supermarkets. 8% saying telco, 8% say retail, 0% say banking. Interesting. Right. Well, so each week we're measuring how well people feel that these different categories and brands have responded. So the question is, how good or bad do you think the response has been? And we're also overlaying it with metrics on trust and likability and various other kind of important brand metrics. It's interesting to see that over time, you guys did pretty well. So supermarkets, come out top and have been consistent through the different categories that we've seen. Obviously, that for a lot of people is actually your source of exercise for the day, is actually going to the supermarket, isn't it? So outside the home, it's probably where you spend quite a bit of your time. But there's obviously a lot of measures that the supermarkets put in place to protect people in terms of getting and offering the hour slots early in the morning for older generations to get there before everybody else. I think have done them favors in terms of how we perceive them. Retail is quite an interesting one because, as you can see from the data, it sort of performs somewhere in the middle of the bands that we've got there. But retailers, when we look across the data, and I'll show you this in a minute, there's a huge degree of variation between those that are performing well and those that aren't performing well. It's quite interesting to see how some have been much more proactive, have contributed more to their communities, and have been seen better as a result. I think banking is an interesting one because this is potentially, for people who work in the banking sector, an opportunity for a lot of the banks to try and change the perception of themselves. We've seen with certain banks have done quite well over this period because they've been quite proactive at releasing funds and investments. Now, it's going to be really interesting to see in the business press, if you read anything about the loans and things like this, the banks are really being hit over the head. So it's going to be quite interesting to see how that plays out for them in the coming weeks. When we look at big tech, so one of the sectors that we're tracking at the moment is how are the big tech companies doing. So you might remember the Cambridge Analytica story last year. You've probably forgotten about it. Lots of these companies over the last 12 months have been in the news for all the wrong reasons. And you don't necessarily need to spend too much time sort of reading about, some of the concerns we have with, labor rights with production of iPhones or issues over privacy. And, it's also at a time when a lot of our data has been given away to the health services at the moment. There's quite a lot of things that might have been called out earlier on, called out last year, that we just seem to have been buried in the press with everything else. As you can see with big tech, Amazon performed quite well, as does Google and Facebook. I think these are the sort of platforms where people get their news. It's where they spend a lot of their time, so it doesn't really surprise us. Down the other end of the spectrum, you've got companies like Uber, who prior to the pandemic still struggling with their image. Their offer of support for key workers is interesting to see. The timing of that came a couple of weeks behind everybody else. UK is not stupid, and you wonder to what extent that actually has played against them compared to other brands in their sort of big tech category. And you can see how that evolves over time. So certainly there's quite a bit this week with Facebook around misinformation. So there's a lawsuit currently in the States, and they've been embroiled in this case. So that might explain the slight dip in perception for them this week. I've been quite interested to see how Samsung have performed, because I mentioned earlier on about this idea of our connection, our sense of community with others around the world, and how there's potentially a bit of geopolitics coming into how different countries are responding and how we're reading the media. There's a lot of that going on. It's also curious with brands that are from Asian countries, and the data set we've got seem to struggle a lot more compared to companies that are from America, from the UK, from Europe, that sort of thing. Samsung, when we were tracking this a couple of weeks ago, really struggled in the first 2 weeks that we started tracking them. It's interesting to see that they are investing quite a bit to try and change their perception at this particular time. So they've got some wellness initiatives. They've also tried to help business community in a kind of small way as well. But curiously, if you correlate the perception of their response, so has it been good or bad, with their perceived level of trust, there's almost a perfect correlation. So as the change in response moves, we're seeing an equal change in the level at which people trust them as a brand. So it just goes to show, and every brand we've measured, this is exactly the same, with the exception of telcos, which is really fascinating. It just goes to show that how you respond as a company is fundamentally important to trust, and ultimately this will have an impact on loyalty, because what we know from the research we've done over the past few years with different clients is when you ask consumers or businesses what makes them trust one, what causes them to buy from one brand over another continuously, it comes down to trust. So these are two really important metrics for companies to be tracking over time, and it's really important to get this right. Now it's interesting looking at retail. Hopefully you can see retail there. I mentioned there's a huge delta difference between the companies at the top and those at the bottom. So this is just this week. So for past few weeks, M&S has been the standout business. But it's really interesting what's going on with Home Bargains. It's not really something you would expect, but as a business, when you read news about what they're doing, they've been very empathetic in their response, they've been very community focused in their local area. And whether that's because their way the business model is designed or the autonomy they give to staff, it's curious to see that they've been perceived to respond quite well compared to companies that are owned by the who's who of retail. So Arcadia Group are not performing particularly well, but neither are companies owned by Mike Ashley. And wouldn't be surprised by that. And again, interesting to see how they're tracking over time. So this is looking at the past 4 weeks for Primark, TK Maxx, Home Bargains, and Topman. And you can see the sort of differences week on week. So yeah, plenty of interesting stuff there in the reputation management. The lead message though is, think about the tone, think about the moment that people are in, and make sure you manage your comms around it. And if you're going to do something that is, that you ultimately want to show care for, or you've got, for the community, then do it in a genuine way. People can read through things quite well. And read the room, I think, is the lead message. So now I'm going to dive into the various different sectors that we've seen. And so we're tracking movements in different sectors each week. We're asking people what they're doing in a particular week. And we've started to ask them about what they intend to do in that category when the lockdown's been removed. Obviously, saying the lockdown's been removed is fairly short-sighted, because there's potential for us to have lockdown measures and social distancing measures for the rest of the year. So there's never really going to be, for the foreseeable future, a strict stop. So you have to take that in mind. But certainly when we've been asking people, so travel is a sector that's been greatly affected by things, and obviously it's the announcement by BA today is it's quite indicative of the time. This is a real serious problem for a lot of companies. In travel, when you ask people whether they feel they are likely to spend more or less in a particular sector than before, when it comes to travel, it's a bit of a sort of scary one, really, and that's that 31% of the UK are claiming that they're likely to spend less in this category after the lockdown, and you've got 27% of people saying they intend to spend more. So there is a delta difference, but extrapolated out to the UK, that's a huge number of people. The only group where we've seen a higher intention to engage in this category is those that are aged 41 to 47. And that could be, maybe they've got kids and they just want to get out of the home. Stressful managing the whole, work-life balance is difficult. So travels, this is something we're going to be monitoring over the next few weeks. It's a sector that, really needs to understand some of this more, because where you, particularly travel aggregators, where you hold your stock and your inventory, or booking companies and things like this, it's going to be really important. Are people more inclined to stay in the UK? Are they more inclined to go overseas? What does the holiday look like? So many questions. And I think there's a lot of work to do to understand this. When it comes to grocery, tracking this over the past 6 weeks, there's definitely a sense that this has calmed down quite a bit. So what we're seeing in our data is that only 1 in 10 people claim that they're likely to buy more items more often. So we're seeing that behavior has sort of calmed down a little bit. But it's interesting to see how many people claim they would, they buy online. So it's a whopping 17%. It's still a huge amount of people who would still go to buy online over this period. But certainly there's a bit of breathing space in the grocery market. So I'm not going to delve too deep in this category for the rest of the presentation. Entertainment's one where there's just fascinating stuff that's going on in entertainment. So if you look at weekly habits, what you generally tend to see is that 45% of the UK are listening to music every day, and 38% of people who are active in gaming or have engaged in the category are playing it every day as well. So for people who are engaged in this category before, it's exacerbated their behaviours a bit more. They're spending more time in it. It's interesting to see also this idea of content. So many people at the moment, lots of businesses are on a bit of, are focusing on content, getting things online, trying to improve their, the message they take out there. It's interesting to compare the types of content people are interested in. So people are more likely, they're twice as likely to seek out content they're familiar with than content that's new. Still a high proportion of people, 15%, will look for new content each week, but predominantly people are looking for older things. So if you're in publishing or you're in content, then there's a big opportunity to perhaps in licensing or using content that you've already got available. If you look at what they're doing each day, sorry, I just realised the title's not correct there, but this is a measure of here we go. This is a measure of what they're doing every day. You've got 45% of people listening to music every day. You've got a really high proportion of people obviously watching TV and so on. But these kind of habits are quite interesting to observe. And we've seen in entertainment in general is that the active people's relationship with it isn't necessarily as passive. So in our coronavirus diary studies, we've been asking people what they do each day in entertainment, and it's really quite interesting because people are doing quite productive things with their time. Not everybody is just sort of putting on an episode of Netflix and sort of turning off the brain. We're seeing a lot of people engaging in arts and crafts, learning new skills, maybe making their own content, making their own mini films at home, and this sort of thing. So there's a whole scope for engagement with people who are looking to do things and to have challenges. And if you've got a million people who were furloughed and used to going to the office every day, I had a client of ours call me up who's unfortunately been furloughed. I asked him, what's it like not working? He said, I'm going mad. I'm just looking for things to do. It's interesting chatting to him about what he is doing, and he's spending a lot of time reading business articles and learning to code in his spare time. Because why not? It's a perfect opportunity. If you're in educational training or content and publishing, there's a huge opportunity here. One sector we've seen that's performed really well over the past few weeks is home and DIY. So people are being, as we know, psychologically, they are feeling like they want to be productive and do something useful. The garden's never looked better and the home's never been cleaner. So 41% of people in the UK are cleaning every day. It's not showing a positive ambition. I'm sure. Yeah, there's obviously good things coming off the back of that. But certainly, we're spending more time being active in home maintenance. If you look at key workers as a group, again, quite interesting to see how they compare to the rest of the UK. But they're certainly much more active in DIY. They're more likely to be searching and buying building and gardening supplies online. So as a subsect, if you're in that sector and you want to engage with this particular group, then the evidence suggests that they're more likely to be engaged in this than people who are non-key workers. So yeah, I think there's plenty of opportunity there. With retail, the lead message is, it's huge concern really about how this market is going to move. And I'm going to show you some data from the CBI in a moment, which is quite terrifying, but also quite interesting. So they can be interesting and terrifying at the same time. But it's curious again to ask people how they perceive themselves to be engaging in this category when the lockdown has been lifted and there's no immediate effect to the public. And that's that 29% of people feel that they are they're going to be spending less in this category after that. And what we've seen when we've asked people that question has been really interesting, is that actually people are more likely to spend more likely to claim they will invest in entertainment and spending time with friends than they are in any consumer category. And I think people, when this is all lifted, people just want to spend time with each other. And you can see that in how people are spending more time using video services. We've seen that in our data as well. It's something we're tracking each week. So retail, it is sluggish, but there are opportunities in different demographics if you look into the data. So if you're in that sector, I think being quite targeted in your approach would certainly make some sense. But when you look across the sector at large, it's pretty sobering reading. I thought this data was fascinating. I took it from off the Guardian website yesterday. It's from CBI, and if you can look at how the sales breaks down, I think this is looking at year on year. I don't know. I need to check that. But the patterns, what's the interesting thing? The curious thing with this is you're finding is that home and DIY, cultural goods, and specialist brands are doing quite well. Are seeing it on par with sort of expectations. When it's things that are related to kind of bigger ticket items, you know, like furniture and things like that, then there's a clear struggling, and with clothing, and that makes sense because we're not necessarily going out and being seen, so it's less about how we're sort of perceived, and that kind of self-identity is not so you know, the demand to exercise that is slightly different when you're at home. But it's interesting to see the pattern there, and I think if you're in an organization where you've got maybe more of a remit to look at different types of products or different types of stock, then there's clearly an opportunity in lifestyle, and particularly when people are investing a lot at home. So we know they're spending more time in DIY and home maintenance and building and so on. Well, then there's a big opportunity in that sector as well, for those that are able to do something with it. Beauty is an interesting one, and that's really the lead message in this sector is that people just want inspiration. So they're getting it from YouTube, they're getting it from beauticians online, influencers, and a lot of people are doing their own rituals at home. That's something we're seeing. There's still an inclination to buy products for those who were active in that sector before, but since they're not going out, they're not necessarily spending as much. But this is a sector we work in quite a bit with different clients, both in retail and in manufacturing. And the lead message from other countries is that actually this sector's done quite well when lockdown measures have been reduced in some way. So they've seen it in the Botox market in China, for example, went through the roof when lockdown measures were reduced. So yeah, it's interesting. It's also comparing that then with key workers. So key workers are compared to the rest of the UK, are more likely to seek out inspiration and tips online. So again, if this is a particular cohort you're interested in, then it would make perfect sense to potentially look at creating content for people who fit this particular category. And there's plenty of them in the UK. So they're more likely to be looking for inspiration online, looking at videos on YouTube and so on. When it comes to exercise, the lead message here is that more of it is happening at home. So we're seeing week on week that despite we've seen the change in that 5% difference in people claiming they're not abiding by the government rules, still a lot of exercise is happening at home. So it's interesting to look at people who are using YouTube and social media to get pre-recorded lessons and to get live lessons. The interesting thing with the exercise sector, the health sector, is that what you generally tend to see is people who are quite active in it are still active in that sector. For those who weren't necessarily active in it before the lockdown, are struggling to know how to spend their money and their investment. This is something we looked at in our diary studies, and we found that when we asked people about their exercise regime, they said to us, I'll go for a walk, and I'm more likely to do that than exercise at home, even if I do want to exercise, even if I would like to exercise at home. The reason is I don't know where to start when it comes to exercising in the household. What equipment do I need? What videos do I follow? It's a complete maze. They really don't know what to do. So I think there's certainly, if you're in that sector, there's helping overcome that barrier would be a good starting place. And then when we look at key workers, it's interesting, you know, they're a group that's more likely to be watching YouTube videos online compared to the rest of the UK, or people who are non-key workers, so people who have sort of regular office jobs. There's no regular office at the moment. But yeah, quite interesting to see how that changes for that particular cohort. And then finally, looking at alcohol, it's quite concerning, really, is how many people claim to be drinking on their own in the UK, and this has been backed up by YouGov recently. where 72% of people are drinking the same or more than they used to. In this case, in the data we've seen, is that 59% of people who were active in the category before are drinking. They do drink on their own at home, and it's quite a significant proportion of that 59% who actually claim to be drinking every day as well. So just something I think we need to bear in mind is the balance in coping in the current situation. You know, hopefully people will lean on or feel they have a community they can go to for support at this particular time. So alcohol is one as well where it's when you look at the different category, the different cohorts, you see quite an interesting picture. So younger people are more likely to be inclined to try newer types of products and so on. And those with dependence are the group that are most likely to be drinking with someone else during the week. There's a high proportion of people as well who are drinking over conference call as well. So if you look at that for key workers, so you've got 23% of the UK claim that they will have a drink remotely with friends over a conference call, compared to 32% of key workers. So you know, that's definitely a mechanism where people will spend time socializing with each other. And again, in this sector, there's a different balance in terms of how key workers are responding to the alcohol sector. So plenty in there. As you can appreciate, we've got lots of data. The purpose of this webinar is to try and give you a kind of macro view on things, or where things are going, and give you a bit of a skim. I think it's interesting with how many companies are looking to be quite innovative and to do things differently. We found that 26% of companies are looking and exploring new opportunities to create revenue during this time. And obviously this type of data is vitally important to understand what are the nuances, how it's changing. We're seeing a lot of clients come to us to ask, you know, what's going to happen when the lockdown ends? And the truth is, it's really difficult to predict what's going to happen. I think the important thing is obviously trying to keep track on it and keep your ear in the market in whatever way that looks like. You know, keeping abreast of what's going on. And there's also, I think, for a lot of companies, reputationally, we need to really think about how we respond as businesses. So how is it we're going to support the community? Doing these webinars for us at Rare is our way of helping people out with the information. So obviously, we've got a team of people producing this week in, week out in order to help the community that we serve, and that's our way of contributing. But what's coming next? Well, we are doing these every week. So the next webinar we will be running is on the 7th of May at 3 p.m. So if you, I'll be sending around a follow-up email with the access to the slides after this, and also if you want, with also a link to the next webinar for next week if you thought this was of use. On our website as well, we've got loads of reports you can download by week. So you're more than welcome to download those and explore the data. We've got the data tables available as well. We've got the coronavirus diary studies, which is our in-depth studies at home and how people are responding. So by all means, you're more than welcome to download that and have a read. There's some interesting stuff in the entertainment sector for sure. And the reputation tracker as well. So if you have got questions about different companies you want to monitor, then please give us a shout. We can help you out with that. One thing that we are getting requests on is doing more B2B and financial services. So if you're interested in that sector, then please let me know. And I realised I've sort of gone over time a little bit, so I will just summarise the findings. And if you've got any questions, we have time to answer them, then I will address them. So if you do have any questions, feel free to just quickly write them in the questions box. But in the meantime, just to kind of summarise where we are as a nation at this particular point with the data that we've got is, overall, we do feel a heightened sense of worry still pervades in the UK, but we are seeing that there's a greater degree of restlessness as well, which will have an impact on how people respond to the instructions they're given with, staying at home, not staying at home, and how to behave in that regard. As we're seeing other countries change their lockdown measures, as a country here, we're going to respond in many different ways. I think there's going to be some frustrations which will exacerbate that restlessness that we feel. But obviously there is a balancing act for lots of companies with the economic consequences of the situation with public safety. And for lots of businesses, they are looking to try to do something innovative. And we've seen that in the data we've collected and from your answers here. Lots of companies trying to do something innovative to create revenue during this particular time from new sources. Whatever you do to respond to that, it's very important to think about how you're potentially going to be perceived during this period, because we know that how you respond to this has a direct impact on your level of trust. So it's very important to get that right with your comms. It's very important to get that right in how you operationalize it. And looking across the sectors in terms of what we might expect when this lockdown's removed, whenever that is, whatever that looks like, I think it would be impossible to say for sure with any degree of certainty how things are going to happen. Even looking at different cultures is going to be difficult, because every culture is going to have a different measure in place. But the indications we're getting at the moment is that if it's related to sort of entertainment and friends and communities, people are potentially more inclined to invest their time and effort there, or show an intention to do so. Things like, retail and the usual consumer categories, at this point, I think it's difficult to see whether we're going to see a huge dramatic uplift in behaviour, unless, of course, businesses are offering something that is, truly quite unique. I'm not sure at this point whether we can expect there to be a huge rush back to the high street, but we'll see. It's going to be too difficult to predict how that's going to happen. Of course, we will know as time goes on. So that's it for today's session. I've just wanted to wrap that up in good time. Thanks very much for attending, and if you have any questions, please let me know via email. My contact details are there. Great, thank you very much. Have a good rest of your Wednesday.